him a lot, 'cause we got him on the spot. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back.
Welcome back to On the Spot. This is Paula Schaffner, and I'm going to be talking about episode 3 of Welcome Back, Kotter. This was originally designed to be the pilot, and I'll talk about why it aired third on September 23rd, 1975. But first, let's start with the IMDb synopsis. Gabriel Kotter is a teacher in Brooklyn, New York, who ends up teaching at his old alma mater, Buchanan High School. He has been assigned to teach the remedial students, better known as the Sweat Hogs, a group to which he used to belong. Kind of wordy. And before I go into what happens in the pilot, I want to read to you from the great TV sitcom book, revised edition 1983, by Rick Mitz, because it has some interesting background information. He quotes Robert Hedges as saying, "Originally, the concept of the program was an upbeat blackboard jungle." Doesn't explain what he meant by that. I don't know if he was being sarcastic. And it continues, "But after the network saw the pilot, they thought it should be lightened up. I suggested that the Marx Brothers had a certain style, so they decided to incorporate some of their routines into the show. Our concept became taking ridiculous situations and turning them into chaos. We're not doing reality." I don't know if Hedges gets full credit. I think I've seen him quoted before. Certainly we can see that he embraced the Marx Brothers feel of the show. Blackboard Jungle, of course, would have been more realistic, obviously updated for the 70s. As he's putting it, it's a ridiculous situation to begin with, and then they're turning it into chaos. Mitz says, "Of course, like any even slightly innovative sitcom in the 70s, controversy surrounded Kotter. Right from the start, it was banned from Boston. The ABC affiliate refused to air the series. They feared the program might aggravate Boston's strife over school busing." Which is interesting. I don't know if that's because this is a multi-ethnic show or what exactly the objection was from the Boston affiliate. He continues, "And instead the show aired on a low-powered UHF channel in the area," back when there was UHF. "For the premiere, the network even edited the episode and deleted a minor quote-unquote crime committed by the Sweat Hogs, but the Boston station wouldn't budge." In a little bit, I'll talk about what those possible edits were. Mitz also says that some thought the show would be promoting drugs. Some people thought the story of potential hoods and pushers was no laughing matter. So there was a reaction that the Sweat Hogs were too thuggish, too much like hoodlums. Also that there was possible drug use. And we'll get into that as we go through the show, because there's definitely an episode, a quite infamous, very special episode about drugs. But there might be some drug jokes along the way. We'll see. He also says that the National Education Association disapproved of Kotter's leniency so much they put an advisor on the show to protect the image of school teachers. And of course, part of what Welcome Back, Kotter was doing was presenting a teacher who had been a sweat hog, and he wanted to be able to connect with students like himself, and so he is less formal. That definitely is something that goes throughout the show. I don't know what exactly the NEA did with the show to make it more compliant. This episode was directed by James Komack, who was also the executive producer. He quit the series 3 times before the show started, and according to Mitz, this was because he hated the concept, was indifferent to Kaplan's brand of humor, and wasn't wild about Kaplan himself. And I won't go into too much backstage gossip, but in later pods I do need to talk about what Kaplan and Komack's relationship was, where the hostility was coming from, how that impacted season 4 in particular. This is still early days, obviously. James Komack was born in 1924 in New York City, so again, somebody with that New York background. Prior to Welcome Back, Kotter, he produced The Courtship of Eddie's Father and a year of Chico and the Man, and a few other shows. And of course, Chico and the Man was a quote-unquote ethnic show, and it was built around a rising young stand-up comic, Freddie Prinze. Komack started directing with 2 episodes of The Dick Van Dyke Show in 1961, and he did a mix of dramas and sitcoms, including, of course, 7 episodes of The Courtship of Eddie's Father. He died in 1997, and he directed until 1987, including Porky's Revenge, so a very different take on teen boys. This episode was written by Peter Meyerson, who was one of the developers of the series for television. Therefore, he gets a writing credit on every episode, although he wouldn't write any more scripts for the show until season 2. He was born in 1931 in the Bronx, and he died in 2013 with surprisingly few writing credits. These were mostly sitcoms, most notably one episode of That Girl in 1967, one Monkees episode, one episode of The Partridge Family, and one episode of The Bob Newhart Show. This episode does not follow the format of the later episodes as far as the cold opening and the tag go, where Gabe tells a joke to Julie in both of them. But the episode actually starts with Julie in their apartment. She's wearing a long sleeve red top, a scarf, and jeans, and she's primping a bit in the bathroom. We see her through the open door, and there's a hanging plant, a sink, and a tub. And then in the previous episode to air, she suggested that Gabe take a bath. The camera follows her as she goes into the living room where Gabe is sleeping, and I noticed he had his watch on. A little mistake there. Of course, he's in the sofa bed. She starts folding the bed and wakes him from what he says is a great dream, although we don't hear any details. She tells him to pick up the pillows. There's applause as he gets out of bed with the pillows, and she finishes folding the bed. He asks what she did that for. She tells him to stop stalling. As he tosses her the sofa cushions and she puts them on the sofa, he says he's not stalling, and she says he should be happy that he's been assigned anywhere. A lot of new teachers can't find jobs at all. We don't know if he's had any teaching experience. He's probably just fresh out of college by a few months. She is, as we'll see later in the episode, the realist and also the optimist at the same time. As she puts the pillows in the closet, he calls her Julie and says James Buchanan isn't anywhere. It's in Bensonhurst, which is in Brooklyn, which is where he spent 4 degenerate years as a student. His words, not mine. He says, you know how rough that is? The gangs, they don't use guns. They insert the bullets manually. And I think that's one of his jokes from his stand-up routine. We freeze on his face as the applause starts, and Kaplan does the live on tape line, which I think sometimes would be at the beginning of the episode and sometimes at the end. Had this episode aired first, this would have been our first glimpse of the hallway, and I noticed that the font for room 11 is different, although the sets aren't dramatically different. The apartment, the hallway, and the classroom. We also would have had Kotter and Woodman at the beginning of the first school scene if this had aired first. That would have been different than what we actually get, which is the mural painting at the beginning of the Great Debate. Kotter narrates, not for the last time on the series, and he calls himself the cute one on the left. By that he means the left side of the screen, although it states right. We of course already met Kotter in the cold opening, but I guess this is sort of our official introduction to him. And I suspect that they had the narration cover over dialogue that wouldn't work for a third episode, and or it referenced the Sweat Hog's violence. Because they could have just had him do the introduction and then that's it, but there's narration, dialogue, narration. So it's a little bit awkward, but they smooth it over as well as they could. I think that this is part of what the editing was. It's not necessarily the minor crime, but I think there may have been something here that they needed to tone down. When Kotter describes Mr. Woodman in his narration, he does it with a joke. We find out that there was a cafeteria riot 10 years ago, and Woodman still blames Kotter. And I don't know if they mean like a food fight or a full-on riot. We don't get many details, and it's just left to the imagination. And I'll talk about the timeline and Kotter's age later. Kotter denies starting the riot. He blames crazy Delaney, who was the one who dropped 2 teachers out of a window to see if they'd hit the ground at the same time as a physics experiment. So again, this idea that the Sweat Hogs are violent thugs, but in a funny way. Kotter calls him Woodface, and then he catches himself. And so this is a reminder that he is trying to be an adult and a teacher, but he falls back into this old habit, and presumably Woodface is what the Sweat Hogs called Mr. Woodman 10 years ago. And we can see here and later that the word Woodface is carved on and near the door. Maybe this is graffiti from 10 years ago, the building is so old, or maybe students continue to call him Woodface. Kotter says these things happened a long time ago, and they're both different people. Things change. Woodman says Kotter is wrong. Nothing changes. Woodman says his motto is conquer thyself. Kotter says, right here in the hall? I don't know if that's a masturbation joke or how we're supposed to take that one. Woodman says Kotter hasn't changed a bit. He still has street mouth. Kotter indignantly says he has a degree in teaching. That's why he's here. So he's emphasizing he has a right to be here. He's a teacher. Woodman says if Kotter wants to teach, he's giving him back his own, the Special Guidance Remedial Academics Group. Kotter says, you're giving me the sweat hogs? So clearly he was assigned to the school and didn't get any details about what the assignment was. Woodman says that Kotter's class launched that revolting name, but to Woodman, they're remedial sweat hogs. This connects to where we had the mural, and the current Sweat Hogs painted Gabe and his classmates as the original Sweat Hogs. So this goes back about 10 years to when Gabe was in high school. Woodman resists the name, but very quickly he sees them as the Sweat Hogs. Just like in the Great Debate, where he started calling the debate team the Turkeys. He's very dignified, but he's willing to adopt insults. Kotter starts to argue, but Woodman puts on his glasses and says that Kotter will find that the first aid is still in room 118. I guess the rooms on the first floor are double digit. Second floor might be the 100s. Third floor, if there's any, might be the 200s. We'll see if that's consistent. He exits and Kotter cautiously opens the door. Vinny is reading something, maybe a comic, while sitting on Kotter's desk, which is over by the blackboard instead of over by the bulletin board as it is with the regular episodes. We get a quick glimpse of the centerfold that Arnold will later be caught with. It looks like you can see breasts, but it's not zoomed in on, of course. Some of the desks are in stage right and the rest are on stage left, so definitely a different configuration to what we get through the rest of the series. When Kotter goes over to the desk, Vinny takes a seat at a student desk. Kotter sets down his briefcase. He greets the class with good morning, and there are close-ups of Juan, Freddie, and Arnold looking hostile. Kotter hesitantly says he's their new homeroom teacher. There's a cut to a shot of 4 students, Vinny in the foreground, and then a girl who I believe is Sylvia, and then a blonde girl, lastly a white guy with sunglasses, and they all look equally hostile. I will talk about Sylvia more in a bit. Gabe says, "My name is Mr. Kotter." Freddie shoots a paper airplane that lands in Kotter's hair. There's laughter and applause. And I don't know if it's the character of Kotter being amused or if it's Kaplan breaking, but he laughs a little. There's a cut to, from the left side of the screen to the right, a brunette girl who may be Latina, a white boy, who I'll get back to in a moment, who's in a football jersey and tan cords, and then Arnold, Freddie, and Juan, who all have their legs propped up on desks. This is not really an episode notable for its guest cast, and of course the extras that we see in the classroom are mostly not the ones that we would get during the main series. Leslie Ackerman played Sylvia, who I believe is the auburn-haired girl who sits by Vinny and seems to be not exactly his girlfriend, but we'll get into that. She was born in New Jersey, I don't know the town or the year, and her acting credits are from 1974 to 2000. I noticed that she was in the first nudie musical movie, which stars Cindy Williams, and she had a role on All in the Family, but mostly she did action dramas like Barnaby Jones, The Streets of San Francisco, Chips, The Incredible Hulk, Simon and Simon, Cagney and Lacey, and Baywatch. She would not return. We also have Mike Agresta as an uncredited student. He was born in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1952. He did a lot of mostly nameless roles, starting with Young Man on All My Children in 1970, although he did play a character named John in 3 episodes of Lust and Love in 2015. Amusingly, he had an uncredited role as an office worker in the pilot episode of Bosom Buddies, and I am hoping to do Bosom Buddies podcast soon as well, so I don't know if I'll recognize him from that. The most recognizable of the nameless students is the one played by Don Stark, who was born in New York City in 1954. He has over 150 acting credits on IMDb, starting with the 1973 TV movie Outrage. He's done movies, sitcoms, and TV dramas, but he is most recognizable for 200 appearances as Bob Pinciotti on That 70s Show, and he returned for That 90s Show. I think that he's the student with the football jersey. It looks enough like him, and I don't think he's the guy with the sunglasses. That's probably Mike Agresta. After that shot with the possible Don Stark, we get a hostile close-up of Vinny. Connor says he's looking forward to a meaningful learning experience for everybody. So very 60s, 70s phrasing. When they don't respond, he acts out himself and an eager child as he says that he'll also be their social studies teacher. I'd wondered before what exactly was going on with his teaching, and we find out more in this episode than we have. So he does homeroom and he also does social studies. And there's applause at the end of this little dialogue with himself. The class looks dubious, and I noticed that you can see a white girl with short wavy brown hair in the row behind Vinny's. So there's sort of 2 rows on each side. So we have Kotter acknowledging, mostly to himself, that he only has rapport with himself at this point, but he's going to keep trying. And we get what would have been our literal introduction to the main 4 sweat hogs. Ironically, there are more catchphrases crammed in here than there were in the previous 2 episodes to air. We get much more of Vinny as the leader in this episode, which would fade over time. Kotter calls him Chairman Barbarino, which I think is not just like a head of an organization, but might be a Chairman Mao joke. And we get an early glimpse of how much Vinny Barbarino loves his own name, and he would eventually even sing about it. Vinny introduces Juan as Epstein, the toughest kid in school, voted most likely to take a life, and I believe that was another thing from Kaplan's stand-up. And Freddie seems proud of Juan for this distinction. And yes, we get the full name of Juan Epstein. Juan Luis Pedro Felipe de Huevos Epstein. So yes, of eggs. And he's from San Juan. I don't know that he's born in San Juan or his ancestry is from San Juan. We find out that his father is Puerto Rican and his mother's maiden name is Biberman. It's implied that his father is Puerto Rican and his mother is Jewish, but they're not consistent about that. And we see that although this is definitely a more menacing version of Epstein than we would get, because as Hedges said, they toned it down, we do have that mischievous gap-tooth Epstein grin. And he gives us a little bit of backstory, starting with his grandfather in 1938. And of course, I had to sit down and figure out how does this fit in with his great-great-grandmother Ruth, who was in the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. So my theory for the moment, until is contradicted, is that grandfather Epstein arrived in San Juan in 1938 and he married Ruth's granddaughter. Their son would have been born around 1939 and he moved to Brooklyn and married Biberman, and Juan was born probably in 59. We'll see. I mean, I think it's implied that Kotter was 16 10 years ago and these sweat hogs are 16 now. But yes, that will not be consistent. And we get a bit of the Juan and Freddie bond with their hip hand slaps and elbows. Hedges says assault is his favorite subject in a very menacing way, especially since we can see that there's a cut on his left eyebrow, and I don't know if that was a character feature or that was an injury that Hedges had. And that is a line that we would not get in a later episode. As for Freddie, we get his first hi there, and an explanation of his nickname Boom Boom, in case you ever wondered. When we meet Arnold, he has to do his laugh. I wrote, in this episode, Vinny is so controlling that Arnold can't even speak without his permission. That's something that would be toned down, but Arnold definitely is, I guess you could say, wimpy. There's what I can only call the Horseshack accent on hello, how are ya? I'm Arnold Horseshack. I can't imitate it. I don't know what it is, but it is his accent. His friends have him explain that he's Arnold Horseshack the last because when they made him, they broke the mold. And he does his laugh again, which gets applause. Gabe looks both weirded out and amused by his first encounter with the sweat hogs, especially Horseshack. You'll notice that nobody else in the class introduces themselves. Maybe they did in the original pilot, but we're just going to focus on these 4 and screw Don Stark and everybody else. We have Horseshack doing his Hunchback of Notre Dame imitation, which ends on an innuendo about ringing his bell. And I wondered if maybe in the original draft it might have been something about his hump. He high-fives the guys, and then he does his laugh again. And we get Cotter's Groucho, which deservedly gets applause. It was always one of Kaplan's best imitations. And he tells Barbarino that this is his class. There's the impression that Barbarino has been pushing around their previous teachers and controlling the class, and Kotter, lenient though he may be, is not going to give up power to Barbarino. Kotter wants them to listen to him. He wants them to pick up their chairs and sit with anybody that they quote-unquote have a relationship with. And he doesn't mean that in a romantic way. It's just sort of 70s talk. Who do you relate to, man? And then he does dialogue with himself and his eager student persona about forming a study group. And then he yells, "Do it!" Because although he is trying to relate to them, there are times he's just going to lose his temper and yell, and they do respond to that. Some of them move their chairs. Some of them just go across the room, and some don't even move. Then he asks what the study group will study. Kotter says whatever grabs you. American history, civics, current events. So again, if you're curious what he's actually teaching, that's part of what social studies is broken down into. They could have just made him a history teacher, but social studies sounds more contemporary. It also, I think, gives them some latitude in covering different topics as a show and as a class. Kotter also says far out, some 60s slang from him. But he also says they can study how to look innocent in a lineup or how to speak clearly with a stocking over their head. He is trying to appeal to them as hoodlums. Vinny says the only thing that grabs Horshack is in a plain brown wrapper. And indeed, Arnold has been looking into a plain brown wrapper for about a minute. As the scene began, the magazine was out of the wrapper, but he must have put it back in. One grabs the wrapper and tosses it to Vinny. Somehow the magazine doesn't slide out. And then Vinny and Freddie play keep away from Arnold. Kotter ends up catching the wrapper, and he takes out a magazine called Girls, with a naked girl on the cover, her long brown hair covering some of her torso. Arnold goes over and says he's into recycling paper. He was about to turn it in. So hey, ecological message, cool. Vinny has an idea. Take one of those chicks, put her up on the wall so that her study group may study her. So yes, he is a male chauvinist pig, as we will see throughout the series, although he does have his more sensitive moments. Kotter's opened the magazine to the centerfold, but the magazine is flat, so we don't actually see anything in the picture, and he and Arnold are staring at it. Vinny asks what Kotter's looking at, so Arnold smiles and he stares at Mr. Kotter. Kotter says he was just reading a biography, and I don't know if he means a biography of a celebrity or a biography of one of the pinup girls. He tells Horshack to sit down, so Horshack sits. Kotter tells Barbarino he might do that, put up a picture, if the group would write a report on censorship, the effect on the male teenager. So what are the girls in the class supposed to do? Nobody speaks up about that. And I realize that this is supposed to be a message about free speech, but they're looking at pornography in a high school classroom. It's the 70s. Vinny says Barbarino don't write no reports for no one. Triple negative. Kotter asks what Barbarino does besides give orders. One says Vinny is the ranking champ of Brooklyn and tells him to take a bow. And of course, we would see a lot of Travolta's moves in the next 3 years, including on the big screen. And Sylvia looks charmed. We still don't know who she is, what she is, but she sits near Vinny and seems to really like him. We find out that one didn't mean that he was the ranking champ, like he had the highest rating, but that ranking in the sense of insults, which Kotter also calls chopping and sounding. And Freddie says the dozens, which oddly enough is the only one of these terms I've actually heard out of the context of this show. So basically it's matching up insults as a contest. We get the first up your nose with a rubber hose, even though previously we had up your nose with a garden hose. And we get the relatively crude off my case toilet face. And I don't know if that's something that they backed off from, but it felt harsher to me. When Kotter wants Washington to write on the board, he obliges. So far, the blackboard has been blank. Obviously, that changes over time. Kotter's insults are from 1965, which is the same year as the cafeteria riot. I wondered, does Barbarino actually have a sister? Because he seems offended anyway. Like maybe even if he didn't have a sister, he wouldn't want her to be insulted. And he's okay with the Rotor-Rooter joke about his father, but no jokes about his mother. That woman is completely holy. And this is something that would become a character trait for Barbarino, that he worships his mother. And I'll talk about that more as time goes on. Kotter says our society has changed in the last 10 years because insults have become more personal. And yes, that seems really quaint now with the rise of social media. The studio audience doesn't know much about Mr. Woodman yet, so there's less resonance to, oh no, he walked in. I thought it was very Mr. Woodman that he's shocked not only by the insults on the blackboard, but by the seats being rearranged. He's very much a person who wants things to be where they should be, like when the sweat hogs changed the signs on the restrooms. He spots the magazine and asks if Kotter has gone berserk. So he felt that assigning Kotter to the sweat hogs was appropriate, but now it's seeming to be backfiring on him. I mean, not that I'm sympathetic with Woodman, I'm just saying from his perspective. Kotter says he's trying to teach his class. Woodman says it's polluting, not teaching. He says that 10 years later, Kotter is still remedial. He's still a sweat hog. Kotter says he's trying to reach these kids by using whatever works, and he thinks it's working. He calls on Horshack and Barbarino to explain, but the whole class is silent. The bell rings and the students file out. Woodman asks what Kotter was saying. Kotter yells that he will not allow Woodman or anybody else to come into this room and chew him out in front of his class. He is a respectable human being, a teacher, a husband, not a 16-year-old sweat hog. So I thought that was interesting. That it makes a very general thing of being a human being, and then there's his role in the school, and then he mentions that he's a husband. So that is part of his identity. Woodman says, anything else, Kotter? Kotter says, yes, up your nose with a rubber hose. There's a snippet of the theme song and applause, and we fade out to the commercial break after that rather long scene. Then we get another rather long scene set in the apartment. Gabe is on the couch, apparently watching a ball game on a little portable TV set. Julie is ladling something out of a pot and into a soup bowl, although this is forgotten pretty quickly. She tells Gabe that he copped out, her using 60s slang. Without looking at her, he says, hey, off my case, toilet case. So he's picked up this insult from the kids. She gives a look not quite to the camera of mingled confusion and annoyance, and she says, what? He smiles and says, I'm sorry, baby. I was wrong that they don't just call each other honey. He turns off the TV with a little remote, which is interesting. Remote control was not common in the 70s, but they have one. She comes over to the couch and puts a pillow in her lap as he stretches out, resting his head on her. He says he really tried, but it just didn't happen. Thomas Wolfe was right. You can't go home again. That's a reference to a novel published posthumously in 1940, and it's not the only literary reference in the episode. That's an example of how Gabe is college educated, and presumably Julie is too. We'll find out more about that in later episodes. He tells Julie not to worry. Something will come along. So we see here that Julie is the practical one, but she also gets to joke, and he enjoys that. There's some really sweet affection between them, including their kisses and her playing with his hair. We find out that they don't have a car, which makes sense. I assume that the school is either walking distance or it's a short bus ride away. Not only because he has to get to class, but because the students come over pretty easily. She gets another joke when she says that the bill collectors will eat their Subway. Another New York reference. As is Kotter saying that he will steal soup from the automat. And we get the first time that the sweat hogs come through the window. The Kotters don't notice them at first. Gabe says that he wants to teach real students, not hitmen in waiting. So again, emphasizing that the sweat hogs are criminals or future criminals. I feel bad for Julie because she's never met Freddie and Vinny before, and these guys just show up in her apartment. She figures out who they are pretty quickly, but still, obviously startled. We have Freddie saying ghetto trash with his particular inflection, and it's ironic, of course, because he and Vinny are the trash that came in the window. And here, as in the other two episodes I've looked at so far, we can see that Kaplan is not yet an actor, especially when he has to yell at people. He just hasn't figured out how to do that with realism. I wrote the note, Sylvia didn't have any lines in the first scene, but she merits a visit to the apartment. And I don't know if they were planning to make Sylvia, if not a sweat hog, at least one of the regulars. I don't know if she's supposed to be sort of a proto-Rosalie. Nonetheless, here she is again. Sylvia, Juan, and Arnold come in. Kotter says he knows why they're all here and he appreciates it, but it didn't work out and there's no way he's going back. Juan and Julie are sitting on the back of the sofa. It's kind of a weird episode because it's like they don't have enough furniture for these uninvited guests, and so there are these weird configurations with the sofa, especially because they're trying to get a certain number of people in different shots. One says, no one wants you back, Kotter. And his delivery here and a few other places in the episode is of a calm, reasonable man in his 20s, not someone trying to sound like a goofy, mischievous teen. Although Hedges is very good, he hasn't yet locked into who Juan is, and it's not just that Juan is more menacing, he just doesn't know where he's going. By the time that they filmed The Great Debate, he locked into this character. The other sweat hogs smile. Kotter looks a little hurt and feel bad for him. I mean, not only did they break into his apartment, but it's not even to beg him to come back. He asks why they came here. One says they wanted to see how the founding sweat hog lives, and he laughs. They're mocking him that he is an old sweat hog. He says they can't stay long because they've got a cab waiting downstairs. Kotter is surprised that they took a cab, as was I, because I thought, well, where did they get the money? And then one says they're going to give it back, so they literally took a cab. And Kotter yells, "You stole the cab?" Vinny says it's Horshack's father's cab, so it's not theft. And I think that is something that actually comes back, that Horshack's father, or maybe stepfather, drives a cab. I think it comes up at least in the Horshack spin-off episode, but we'll see about that. This is acted and directed like suddenly we're in a dark comedy or in West Side Story. Why'd we tie him up, Vinny? Unnerving. Horshack is meant to be weird, but not that weird. And why did they tie him up? So again, more menacing than we would get in later episodes. And Julie looks genuinely afraid of Vinny leering at her when he says that Kotter sees a lot of action, and you can see her inching back on the couch. She goes over to Kotter partly to say that, hey, I'm his wife, and I think also for protection. And Kotter says that this is his wife, and if Vinny's mother is off limits, then so is Mrs. Kotter. And he imitates Vinny saying, "The woman's holy." I guess one of the reasons why they brought Sylvia along was so that she could have the line about Vinny marrying her behind the billboards on 84th Street. A sex line. And that's one reason I thought, well, maybe she's supposed to be like the pre-Rosalie character, but I think Rosalie is a lot tougher than Sylvia. Sylvia is kind of sweet. Freddie reappears after about 10 seconds in the closet, but I don't know how he fit in there. It was a weird choice to have him go in there. Arnold is much smaller. The sweat hogs gather on the couch, but Gabe grabs the album and tells them if they want something, ask, don't grab. Julie takes the album and says, "Come on, honey, show them." He takes it from her and tells her to ask and not grab. She makes a face at him. So although Julie looked scared and uncomfortable, the sweat hogs quickly win her over. The kids all ask to see the album, so Gabe says all right, just for a couple of minutes. He and Julie squeeze in between Freddie and Vinny on the couch. Vinny finds a pressed rose and calls it a cute flower. He teases that Kotter wore it to the senior prom and it looked lovely on Kotter's organdy gown, and his friends laugh at this joke about drag. Gabe takes the flower back and says it was his date's, but she didn't show up. So we'll see if that's consistent with future stories about the prom. The students sarcastically say, "Aww," but Julie isn't sarcastic with her sympathy, and she calls him honey and takes his arm. Freddie wants to see pictures of Kotter when he didn't have his afro, and it is noticeable that Kaplan has fuller curly hair than Jacobs does. One points at one picture and calls the guy a schlep. I always thought that schlep was like carry heavy stuff a long way. I hadn't really heard it applied to a person. Kotter denies that it's him and says it's his friend, Morty the schlep. And of course, both of these characters, Juan and Gabe, are Jewish, so they're using Yiddish. Arnold does his laugh for a while, including in close-up a couple times, until Vinny tells him, "Cut it!" and Julie looks amused. Vinny points and asks, "Who's the chick?" So again, calling girls chicks. Kotter says it's Ellen. Vinny elbows Mrs. Kotter and tells her she's got nothing to worry about with this one. She's a dog. His friends and Julie laugh. Julie doesn't speak up. And she presumably knows who Ellen is, but maybe she just thinks this is so outrageous that it's funny. Kotter glares and says his sister is not a dog. So I don't know if it's consistent that Kotter has a sister named Ellen, but there we are. The students all stand, and Vinny says they'd love to stay, but Horshack is buying them all hot dogs at Nathan's. Another New York reference. One, who's now standing on the couch, says they just want to see what happens to a sweat hog who leaves Buchanan without handcuffs on. So again, the idea that all sweat hogs are hoods. Julie, who's got her arms crossed, asks what he thinks. One says it ain't any different. Kotter has one room, he sleeps on a sofa, his kitchen is in the middle of the living room, and you still gotta lock the windows to keep the bums out. Freddie laughs. His point is that Kotter went to college, was supposed to better himself, but he's still living in near poverty. Just as Freddie called himself and his friends trash, Juan is saying that he and his friends are bums. They are insulting Kotter, but also themselves. Kotter sarcastically thanks Epstein. Sylvia is now holding Vinny's hand in two of hers. When I would watch this episode as a kid at the time, and even more so in syndication, I always wondered, was this meant to be Vinny's casual girlfriend? Who is she? What is she doing? Is she just possessive of him and he likes to have sex with her? What is their deal? We'll never know. And we see here that Vinny is the polite one and or the spokesman for the group, but that's partly because he's a decoy and partly because that's his personality. I don't know if Sylvia was in on this. I kind of doubt it. They probably just said, hey, we're going to go over to Kotter's. And she said, hey, I want to see his apartment. Vinny offers to show Mrs. Kotter how to make lasagna, and presumably it's his mother's recipe. It's because he's Italian. They know how to make lasagna. And we'll have future episodes where we find out more about Julie's cooking skills. And while that's going on, the other three steal the TV. Vinny and Freddie ignore Kotter telling them not to go out the window. Whether or not he's their teacher, they're just not going to listen to him. There would be future comings and goings through that living room window. Kotter wants to move away, but Julie says that she likes them. I thought that was an interesting character moment. She starts out scared and distrustful, but they kind of win her over because they're so funny, I guess. Kotter says that he wants to move to Nebraska, and we'll later find out that that's where Julie is from. But I think it's just that in this episode, Nebraska is seen as the antithesis of New York City, especially Brooklyn. Julie loyally says that whatever he decides, she'll be there. Horshack is the one who brings back the TV and I think the remote, and he does his laugh again. I don't know if Horshack was 100% on board with this, or if they just wanted to see if they could steal the TV and they didn't want to keep it. I don't know if he talked them out of it, if Sylvia said something. I thought it was an interesting choice to have him be the one to return it. And Julie is very amused by his return and his laugh. Gabe asks how she can laugh when someone just stole her television. She points out that Arnold brought it back. As Kotter gets up and sarcastically says, that makes a big difference, I can see that there's a bread bag labeled bread in a curvy lowercase font. So my new headcanon is that Julie had art classes and she's the one who made the bread bag and painted closet on their closet. We can see that Julie is the realist. There's this very intimate scene of her lying on top of him and the way that they smile at each other. They're also just very sweet together in this episode. And I don't remember much about it, but I think I did go through a period in my preteens where I kind of thought the Kotters were relationship goals. I thought they were really sweet and fun together. I mean, now the idea of sitting around the apartment waiting for my husband to come home and tell me corny jokes, well, okay, there are worse fates, but yeah, less appealing. But at the time, compared to other sitcom couples, they look pretty good. And this is something that we see definitely in season 1, and that may change over time, but we'll see. She says it's hard for him to accept that the best part of him grew up in the streets. And this is a contrast to later. In this episode, I think by meeting the Sweat Hogs, it reminds her of this kind of wild, goofy side of her husband that she's attracted to. It's real, I guess, for her, and maybe a contrast to growing up in Nebraska. And I don't know where they met. I don't know if that ever comes up. Maybe they met in college. In this episode, she's the one who's saying it's fun to have the Sweat Hogs over. That will definitely change. She will see them more as an invasive force, although in her own way she's fond of them. In this episode, he is the one who does not want them here, does not want them coming through the door or the window and looking at his photo album and making fun of him and his sister and making fun of the apartment. But that's the setup we have in the pilot, at least. And he teasingly says that if it wasn't for her, he would have married somebody else. But then we can see that he gives her a squeezing hug and she looks content lying so close and on top of him. They, I assume, are still newlyweds at this point, and there definitely is affection between them and a low-key sexiness. Then in the tag, we're back in the classroom, but the desks are lined up more neatly. Kotter is writing on the board, study groups, A, B, C. So I guess he's going to break them up into 3 study groups, possibly based on who they have a relationship with, but who knows. When we see Woodman in the open doorway, there's graffiti in the background that says Finnegan's Wake. So that was a surprise, a James Joyce reference, just randomly there. Woodman comes in and he's upset about Kotter being there. He even puts his hand to his face. Kotter turns, smiles, and says hi. Woodman thought that Kotter quit since he said up Woodman's nose with a rubber hose, but Kotter tells him to remove the rubber hose. He's back. If Woodman wants Kotter out, he'll have to fire him. Now, I don't know if there's some edits because of the pilot conversion, but Kotter doesn't actually say to Woodman that he quits. I mean, we assume that he does because of his conversation with Julie and then later the sweat hogs in his apartment. That was just sort of a little writing or editing glitch. Woodman says Kotter knows how he hates trouble with the Board of Education, and I think that that is a thing that we will hear more of with his character, his clashes with the Board of Education. Kotter says then Woodman is stuck with him. So the thing of a sitcom where you're in a situation and you're stuck in it. Vinny and Sylvia come in with their arms around each other and they're delighted to see Kotter. The other students follow and are also happy. I heard one saying round 2 like it's a boxing match. Arnold comes in last and he's looking at the centerfold again. Kotter cheerfully says good morning, and he gets more of a response than he did the previous morning. Sylvia is glad that Mr. Kotter is back. She wants to do a report on male chauvinism. Vinny is going to do a report on the rip-off women's movement, so their relationship is probably doomed, but not only for that reason. Juan is going to do a report on the implications of the socializations of Puerto Rican Jews, playfully using polysyllabic social science terminology. Freddie is going to pretend to write a report on playing the bass, and there's applause. Juan and Freddie smile at each other. So this is definitely an episode where I felt like they were the buddies. Woodman pulls Kotter aside to say he doesn't quite know what's going on here, but he's one hell of a principal. And yeah, he's the principal. That slipped by. They didn't fix it. I think maybe at that point they didn't know that they were going to have an off-screen principal and Woodman would be the vice principal. Woodman says that he finally got the sweat hogs motivated. Kotter starts to say he had something to do with it, but Woodman interrupts and says Kotter is a perfect example of what Woodman can do once he puts his mind to it. If not for Mr. Woodman, Kotter would have turned out to be just another hood. So that's a recurring thing that somehow Kotter left the high school without wearing handcuffs. Kotter does his Groucho imitation again, and he does a pun on principals, so I guess that's one reason why it wouldn't have worked to have Woodman be the vice principal. And we have the whole class attacking Woodman, who says that they have a long way to go. So sort of like in The Great Debate, where Kotter says that he still has a lot to teach them. Whoever is motivating the sweat hogs, they still have a long way to go. For the third episode in a row, we get a title drop as Kotter says, "Welcome back." This episode definitely had potential. You can see how much of what would become this series, especially season 1, is already here, including catchphrases and characterization, but they did need to change the tone in order for it to be successful. Now, I suppose you could argue that it would have been a more interesting or gritty show if they had kept that more criminal edge to the sweat hogs, but I wouldn't have watched it at ages 7 to 11. I wanted the relatively goofy, sweet show, and I think now as well. I just prefer that tone. But you can see why ABC backed away from having this be America's first glimpse of the sweat hogs. It was just a little too much. They did let it air later in the month, but with some modifications and that slight frame that this is actually a flashback to the first couple days of Kotter coming back to Buchanan to teach the new class of sweat hogs. That said, I'm going to rate each of these episodes on an F-, I certainly hope not, but we'll see, to A+, unlikely but not impossible grading scale. Just like Basket Case, this gets a B. I found it funny and very interesting and just had a good time, but it was in a slightly different world than what I think of as the Kotter world. Just in itself, the episode does work. It's pretty well constructed. It's basically just the two scenes. The scene in the school and the scene at home, but with the introductory scene at home and the tag back in the classroom. I think that having these longer scenes and playing out and just exploring the characters worked well. Oh yeah, there was also the hallway scene, but that was a lead-in to the classroom. I feel like the Great Debate was pretty evenly distributed among the four main sweat hogs, although one was the standout for me as far as the most interesting character to watch. Basket Case was supposed to be about Freddie, but ended up being more about Gabe and Vinny. This one, Vinny is the leader, but everybody has their moment in the spotlight. I didn't enjoy it as much as I would have because I felt like, well, that's not my Arnold, that's not my Juan. Vinny is pretty much Vinny, and Freddie is not drastically different than what we saw in the other two episodes. Gabe's conflict of he's the teacher, but he's an ex-sweat hog is definitely here in the pilot, and that is something that will go through much of the series. I felt Woodman was a little bit weaker than in the other two episodes. He hasn't quite found his footing yet. And I know it's confusing because I'm talking about this as both the first and the third episode. Like I said, I don't really know what they were going for with the Sylvia character, but she's all right. I just really enjoyed this episode. Flaws and strangeness and all. So yeah, a B. I also am choosing a head of the class for each episode. That doesn't necessarily have to be a student, and it doesn't have to be the person with the biggest role in the episode, but more the person that I most enjoyed. So yeah, it was one for the Great Debate, and then it was Vinny for Basket Case. And this one, I'm going with Julie, because not only is she not simply relegated to the beginning and the end and doesn't really have much impact on the plot, she is the person that we start the episode with. It almost feels like it's her story until, of course, she's not at the school. We have her interacting with Gabe, and she is playful and loyal, but also realistic. She is affectionate and sensible, and yet willing to be charmed by randomness once she gets used to it. I just thought she was the most interesting character to watch in the episode. It seems kind of a shame that they offer her that in the pilot, and then they back away from that in the next two episodes. Obviously, that's not a permanent thing. She will be integrated into the show more, but I talked about this before, that it took a while to integrate them. I forgot that in the pilot, we actually were already there. I think also what I really enjoyed about Julie is what she revealed about Gabe, what she brought out in him. A certain sweetness, vulnerability. She's the only person at this point that he can really be totally honest with. I think by airing third, they softened the impact of this weirdness, and yet it's not like the Bob Newhart show, which aired their pilot 9th of the first season, and it is jarringly different from Emily's hair to Jerry's character. At least by having a pilot go third, your images of the characters and the show are not yet as subtle. Next time I'll be discussing the 4th episode to air, called Who Done It, which is a Rosalie episode. Very interesting one, and I will have a special guest star, Lisa Fernandez of the Night After Night Laverne and Shirley podcast, who is as big a Rosalie fan as I am, and we will have a lot to unpack about that. Until next time, stay off my case, Toilet Face.
Tease him a lot, 'cause we got him on the spot. Welcome back.